Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of You'll Never Talk Alone. I'm your friend Joseph Craven. I'm joined, as always, by Mr. Alex Level. We are having to deal with the consequences of our actions. We claimed that the podcast returning in the calendar year of our Lord 2023 would help fix Liverpool's problems. However, it seems like we have only compounded them into significantly worse issues. Liverpool coming off of an underwhelming draw in the FA Cup, coming off of an extremely disappointing loss, 3-0 to Brighton in the league. And here we are now on January 15th, as of the recording of this episode, wondering what is left ahead of us. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, some big picture stuff in this episode. But first and foremost, Alex, I'm going to open up things with this particular question. I'm curious your opinion on this. I saw this headline on the always reputable ESPN FC, the world's greatest soccer website, unquestionably so. It is in everyone's opinion that it is a good website and not, in fact, a terrible website. But they had this headline, and it did make me think a little bit about this because I want to say friend of the program / frequent contributor to the program, Will Cave, said this in a group text, that this felt worse than the 7-0 to Aston Villa. Is that right?
7-2.
7-2 to Aston Villa. Was it Will who said it or Andrew Ainsworth? I forget. I think it was Will who said it. But one of them said that that 3-0 loss to Brighton felt worse than that. And so the question kind of is, Alex, what's your opinion on this? Is that 3-0 to Brighton the worst loss that we've suffered under Klopp from a performance standpoint? Obviously, 7-2, scoreline, terrible. Much worse scoreline. But that just felt like the least inspired, sloppiest, most discombobulated. Like everything was just bad about it. Was that the worst we've seen under Klopp's regime? Or where does it kind of at least serve as a contender for that title?
It's definitely up there. It's hard to say exactly because thinking back, the super injury season, version 1, I guess we can call it now because this is version 2. That had a lot of those, But I also saw a kind of a nice follow up to that point that you just made, is that a lot of people saw like, okay, we can really pinpoint the issues here. It's that everyone is hurt, and that's all that needs to change. And once they're not hurt, we'll be better. And that's exactly what happened the following season. So there was some hope that you could really look forward to. But right now, it just doesn't feel like we do have the same level of hope, which sucks. And I mean, I think we're unfortunately seeing the fans go a bit crazy with some of the downcastness. But right now, it just feels...
No.
Yeah, who would have thought?
Fan base is overreacting? Never.
It's insane.
It is.
But yeah, I mean, was terrible. This was one of the worst games I've ever seen us play, especially under Klopp. It was very much a Brendan Rodgers Liverpool performance, harkening back to when we started this. Here we are yet again talking about the same things we did, like 8 years ago. The same, What's wrong with this team? We have good enough players. They shouldn't be this bad. But we just look devoid of any motivation, any plans, any ideas, any energy. I can't even really recall us having a good chance. Like, I think the Gakpo chance was our best one of the whole match, and it was kind of a half chance because he didn't really know where the ball was when he got it, and then didn't really know where the ball was when he was trying to poke it home. Other than that, there was just never a point in that match where it looked like we were going to score or even threaten, and that was sad. And it keeps happening. Like we drew in the cup, but it was the same type of performance. We just happened to score twice somehow. But this was a culmination of all the things that have been happening over the past few weeks, and it sucks. I think we've both said it's not even anger that we feel. It's just kind of a feeling of emptiness and just like, ugh.
It's a little bit like that classic parental line of "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed."
Yeah,
is kind of how it feels right now. It's just disappointing because we know a couple of things. A, we know that the talent level is there, when this team is healthy and this team is rolling. We know the talent level's there. We also know that the time is kind of ticking. The timer is rather kind of ticking on a lot of the core. We talked about that a lot last episode. Virgil's not getting any younger. Mo's not getting any younger. Allison's starting to get a little bit older too. Although at the same time, I just feel like Allison has nobody in front of him, and that's really been a lot of his issues. But there a lot of the core of this team is aging, and yes, we're doing a great job of bringing in younger guys. All of them are hurt, so then there's that issue. But so we know that like the talent's there, but the timer's ticking, and so it's this disappointment of we need to take advantage of where we are right now because we don't want to always have to deal. We don't want to have to deal with this all season long, where it feels bleak and it feels so bleak is the right word for it. That's what you kind of said earlier. It almost feels like we don't have much hope to fall back on in terms of salvaging this season for sure, but there's that kind of underlying frustration or fear that the clock is going to wind down on the careers of our core players with something like this, and not them being able to go out on top and go out on the high note that they deserve to go out on. That might be still to this point pretty unfounded, because we've seen so many players whose careers continue into their 30s and they're still contributing on a solid level, like training routines and disciplines and just like medical science, athletic training. All of that is just at a different point at this level in 2023. So like it's not like, oh, you're 29 years old, your career's done. That's not the case anymore like it used to be. But there is kind of that underlying. So that's why it feels exactly like you said. We're not mad at it's just at the whole thing. We're disappointed in the fact that we don't want this to be the way that things end for those players. And I don't think they will still. But you have a performance like that, which I do think is, for the most part, that is top to bottom, got to be considered one of the worst performances we've ever had under Jurgen Klopp, because top to bottom, not a single thing was good. Defense was bad. Midfield was non-existent. As you mentioned, there was nothing in attack. It was just top to bottom an abject disaster.
Yeah.
And that is frustrating and disappointing to deal with, because we know what our expectations really are, but we know that we're at a point at which we shouldn't have to be like, oh, well, we're building for next year. Like, we're not there anymore as a club. That was 8 years ago. Exactly. Yeah. We're having flashbacks to 8 years ago when we know we're not the same club. And I think that plays a major role in all of this.
It definitely does. It shouldn't be where we are. It kind of, I know that was a large part of what we wanted to actually discuss throughout the course of this episode, is the long-term issues and what the solutions to those are. It shouldn't be, considering what we've done over the past few seasons and how good we've been, where we should be stuck right now. Like we shouldn't be in this weird, I don't even want to call it a transition period. It's just like we don't know what we're doing with the squad.
Yeah.
And
it shouldn't be.
No. And it's baffling how we've ended up here. And there's some things that can be explained with just bad luck or misfortune or side effects of how we play. But other stuff is things that we thought we were so good at, like the scouting and the club management and the like family atmosphere of the backroom staff. And I don't think that is lost, but I think there's some decisions and some shortcomings and some gaps that we have, and things that have been happening recently even that are pretty worrying about how the stuff that was that got us to our peak is now kind of leading to our decline.
Yes, absolutely. And that does bleed into what we wanted to talk about in this particular episode. As you pointed out, we wanted to focus on what out of all of this, because last week we talked a lot about the big picture of where we've been, and so why this season feels so frustrating compared to how we know we've been performing over the last few seasons, how we know this team can still perform, and how the expectation level is set. But as we look to the future, we have to look big picture and say, okay, we just last episode, we looked back. Now let's look forward. How many of these things do you think, Alex, are factors that will play into the long term? Obviously, injuries are injuries. If you've got all of your replacement players, Luis Diaz, Diogo Jota, all the guys that you were wanting to bring in to be the youth revolution and the rejuvenation of the squad, all those guys you wanted to be able to rely on, they're hurt and they're missing significant time. And then as soon as they're, in Darwin Nunez, I didn't even mention, Darwin and, in his slowness to be able to adjust to the Premier League game as well. But you've got all those factors playing into it. Yes, those are short-term things. Those are temporary issues, obviously, much like injury season part 1, as you so aptly called it. The solution to that is get everyone healthy. And what do you know? It worked out pretty well. Right now, the solution to short-term things is pretty much the same. Get everyone healthy and continue that process that we've begun of getting new blood in there, getting youth in there, getting fresh legs in the rotation. What about long-term stuff? When you look at the issues that are going on, and you've kind of mentioned a little bit about some of the changes at the top, and we can talk about that in more detail later, or we can talk about it now as well. But what are some of the long-term things that when you look at what the club is going through right now, you look at it and say, this is not something we just have to wait and see on. This is something that we have to really focus on addressing because this is a bigger issue than maybe we've been willing to admit, or a bigger issue than we've had to deal with up to now. What are some of those longer-term things that you see?
I think they all do ladder up a bit to the ownership discussion and the financial model that the club
there's no
is
skirting
run on.
around it. We got to talk about it. I was going to save it for a later point. We got to talk about it now. So,
but it all kind of ladders up to that. It's because it's been pretty clear the way that the club runs is it sustains itself. The owners are not putting in much of their money, or they're just loaning it to the club and taking it back over time. And the things that they've done to maybe get more self-sustaining money is remodel the main stand and add on to the Anfield Road end of the stadium. So those things should help long-term. It might take a little while. It's currently happening right now. That was definitely a big expenditure, especially right after a pandemic. So that is going to hurt right now. And I think it's hurt a bit of what we're trying to do in the market. So we're stuck still selling to buy, which previous to this season, we didn't want to sell many of the people because everybody was contributing or was injured. So we didn't have a way to get rid of them. But that needs to be reevaluated a little bit because, as has been pointed out in every discussion between Carragher and Neville, you can't run a club at the top end like that anymore as much as you want to. You've got to put some money in.
Yeah, that was a trend that started up in, obviously, when you had the big time financial takeovers of like City and Chelsea, 20 years ago, whenever it was, that they kind of were able to, it was established as like that's the kind of the quote unquote new way of building a team, is just sell the team to someone with endless financial resources. That trend kind of continued, but obviously there were more feasible trends that continued underlying. So other teams didn't have to feel like they had to do that in order to keep surviving. But there has been that trend of what they've been talking about in the past few years specifically, where it seems like it's been a more rapid adjustment, to me at least, of this is how you build a team, to all of a sudden, okay, now that doesn't work at all. And I think that's an interesting, and I'm not obviously not a financial guy, so I don't understand how these things work, but that's a fascinating thing to me, how quickly that has changed and how quickly the game itself has changed from that model being a model you can use to very quickly go, no, this is like really obsolete and only took like 2 or 3 seasons.
Right. And it's coupled into, I think, the larger problem that we have to look at, and it's not necessarily a problem, but it's just a byproduct, really, is that
Jordan Henderson. Sorry.
It's the schedule is most packed that it's ever been in the history of the game, and that's not going to change. It's just going to get worse and worse. They're not going to ditch any of the cups because you can't mess with history, yada, yada, yada.
Yep.
The preseason tours are going to be longer. The gaps are going to be shorter. There's going to be more summer tournaments. There's going to be more international tournaments. And that does not dovetail well with our high intensity style. And we're seeing right now this season that the high intensity style that was needed with the kind of group of players we assembled that was able to overperform expectations and win all the stuff that they did against all the odds. Like there's objectively there, yes, the players are good. And yes, we have an amazing manager, but looking at what we've been up against financially and resource wise, there's kind of no way we should have really been truly in that conversation, let alone achieved as much as we did. But because of those two things now, we have to bring in more people to have a 20-person squad, not an 18 or a 15-person squad, because we can't keep playing the same players over and over again in the way that we play when we're at our best and expect them to do that 3 years in a row. Like you're looking at players like Fabinho, who isn't even as old as a lot of our older players, who he's done. Like his legs are gone for now. He hasn't had a chance to have a break. He's got a little better after the World Cup when he went to the Brazil squad and didn't play, so just got to rest. But I mean, the first
it turns out, controversial opinion here, but turns out rest is helpful. Who knew?
Yeah, who would have thought? And that not only is it leading to the people getting tired, it's leading to more and more injuries, more frequent injuries, and coupling that with the fact that our medical department seems to be in chaos and doesn't have any people, and we're still looking for a head physio and all that. We're not managing the overworked players very well, and it's leading to a huge swath of injuries. And I mean, we're not the only club that's facing it, but for a club that is in the position we are, that's with the highest expectations and the littlest margin for error in terms of bringing people in and making sure they hit the ground running, like we don't have the luxury of having half of them missing most of the time. So I think that is probably one thing we really need to evaluate. And I don't want to see it solved by some sports washing regime, which seems to be what's coming up, and most likely because that's who can really afford clubs anymore. But yeah, it's kind of undeniable at this point that a club at the top level needs that depth of squad to accommodate for the highly intense tactics that they play. And we're just seeing the side effect of not being able to do that, getting the best out of the 15 that we had, and paying the price now for playing them 70 matches a season for the past 3 years.
Yeah, no question. It makes you wonder a little bit because obviously, Fenway has never been super directly involved. You were talking a minute ago about how they obviously were trying to set up the club itself to be monetarily self-sufficient, not put in their money. And but even beyond that, I mean, the amount of times that they actually are, members or representatives rather are present at matches had shrunk a lot over the years. It just wasn't super frequent. It was, and then of course the sale possibilities, and exploring all of that kind of shows that like they're obviously it's a business regime. So it makes total sense. They would approach it like a business and say, this is an investment. And now that it could be mega uber profitable for us, it kind of makes sense for us to explore this. Like you can't fault them for that because that's their entire business model. So like you can't be surprised and fault them for it sticking with their business model. But all that being said, and this is like pure speculation, but you kind of get the idea looking back that they really like put all like the trust, in people like Michael Edwards and, a lot of the people that they kind of had in place to be the front office people. But you kind of, and again, pure speculation, having absolutely nothing to, build this off of other than looking at the fact that so many of those people have left, you have to wonder what else might have been going on in those relationships and whether the people that they put in place to kind of be their, what's the word I'm looking for? Not caretakers, but, something along those lines. Stewards.
Like
stewards. I guess the stewards of the club, the people they put in place, you have to wonder if the stewards didn't trust them. And maybe they were trying to put trust in the stewards, but the stewards did not find them to be trustworthy enough. And that's why we've seen so many changes in that regard. And essentially what I'm getting at is that you really do, and I think we in general have become more aware from business models, not just in clubs, but just in business in general, the impact in modern culture of weak leadership and leadership that is not willing to lead well. And, real leadership, not just being we're good with decisions and we have money, but real leadership being, involvement, and real leadership being equipping their employees or equipping their stewards to succeed best. And if you have someone like, Edwards, who seems like this was a dream scenario for him, who's willing to walk away, there's got to be something that's not quite right behind the scenes. And again, this is pure speculation, but you look at the circumstances around it, and you have to wonder a little bit about like whether I don't know about what else could have been going on, because now the club does look like it's suffering from the effects of insufficient and weaker leadership from the top down. And I think we're having to kind of deal with those ramifications now. Again, pure speculation on my part about it, but you look at everything that is going on in terms of the way it's being run, and now, of course, possibly being for sale. And you have to wonder if over the past couple of years, Fenway was really checking out a lot more, and it was not sitting well with the people they had put in place. But that's, again, that comes from just kind of a general understanding of workplace culture and not from any insider knowledge, right? So that's why I say it's all pure speculation, but something doesn't seem to be quite right. But then it does lead to what you were talking about are we going to be able to sustain, interest and sustain, I don't know if sustain is the right word, but are we as observers from afar going to be able to really get behind a new regime if the new regime is sports washing regime? If that is the case, that raises up a whole bunch of other questions. But I don't know. Those are hypotheticals. I don't know if I'm ready to really think all the way through.
Yeah, we've got other problems to talk about before we even get to that one.
Yeah, exactly. We'll deal with that if the situation ever calls for it. Hopefully, it's not a discussion we have to worry too much about. But all that being said, that's what I can kind of look at and see. I don't know if there's other things that stand out to you, Alex, in terms of long-term issues that you wanted to get to before I have another question for you, but it can wait for a moment. I don't want to step through or step over if you had anything else you wanted to add real fast.
I think it's kind of the second part of that. I mean, you pointed out Michael Edwards left, and not only him, like the entire team that he built for the most part left. So
there's something weird about that.
Yeah. Like whether it be a change of philosophy or some sort of writing on the wall or something, like the team that built the squad that we have that was able to just do all these great things, they left for some reason, and now we're in this weird transitionary period, and that needs to be fixed as well, because it wasn't even all about the incomings. It was about the outgoings of us getting to squeeze 30 mil out of Bournemouth for Solanke, or 2,000 billion million bajillion for Harry Wilson. Just like getting these ridiculous fees for these players that we didn't want and had no role. And I think that's going to be difficult for whichever team comes in, because we have a lot of players now that are in the same position that I don't know if we're going to be able to get that kind of fee for some of them, because they just haven't performed, or they're not in a spot where they're an uncut gem or potential that could be unlocked. Like we've just got a lot of, I don't want to say dead weight in the squad, but just they're clearly not in the plans that much, or if they are in the plans, they're not able to deliver at the level that we need them to deliver. And that's got to be refreshed. But with the lack of resources they might bring in, like doing the larger rebuild is going to be more difficult. And I think that might lead to the need to do a bit different model for transfers. Because you look at the players we bring in, and they've been great signings, but I don't necessarily know if they're surprises. Like we're not doing the same thing that Brighton has been doing with their transfers, where they're plucking these players from South America or like Belgium or some of those smaller markets. We're letting players that we've been scouting for a while go to a mid-sized club or
Right.
slightly smaller, like second tier below the top clubs, grow a little bit, play in bigger leagues, and then we're bringing them in for still fairly sizable money, but not like astronomical. We're paying for a superstar at their peak. Like we're hitting them right before their peak, but they're not out of nowhere people. Like Fabinho was a known quantity before we brought him in. That's why everybody was excited. And Virgil was a known quantity, and Allison was a known quantity, and Diaz was a known quantity. I think the only one that would be considered a signing like I'm talking about is like Simikas, where no one had really seen him. No one was watching Pex Vola. No, he played for like Willem II. No one was really watching them play all that much while he was on loan from Olympiacos, because no one was watching Olympiacos.
Right, and there was an aspect of that that's very reminiscent of trying to recreate the Andy Robertson move,
right?
Where it's like, he was there and he was okay, but like we were like, oh no, he would fit, he'll be ideal, bring him in. I think there's a lot of that with that, where it's like, oh yeah, we found this other left back who really matches the same profile. Bring him in. So I think that's an interesting note as well.
Yeah, so if we're not going to have the mega bucks or just the kind of the flat fee to bring in those levels of signings anymore without sales, then we still need to be able to afford players without having to sell. Like the Gakpo deal was a great deal, and it was an opportunistic deal for the fee that it was, but I don't think we're going to get those that often, where we get someone from like a top team in a they're like a big, smaller league, I guess. Like the Eredivisie is kind of always fluctuate, like fighting with the Portuguese league for coefficient points. Yep. But we may have to look at doing some more like Atalanta style scouting, or even like Brighton style scouting, that are bringing in quality players that are able to step up, and maybe just giving them more time or betting them in with some of the core players, just to make sure that we have enough depth to actually be able to play when we do get hit with 15, 16, 17 injuries. And I think that there were links to Sven Mislintat, who worked at Dortmund and then was brought into Arsenal, and people didn't like it, but then a lot of his products have either gone on to different clubs and been really good, or come good for Arsenal at this point. So that kind of seems to be like, that's what we're looking to do, maybe a bit more, but I think we will have to start thinking like that unless we change how we spend and change how we operate on that front.
I'm not super familiar with the work of Sven Mislintat outside of his him being in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Because that is the most like North Pole elf sounding name I've ever heard. That's the coolest name I've ever heard in my entire life. I hate to do that like classic American thing of making a comparison to an American sport, but there's so much about this that reminds me of those teams you see. In particular, like look at an NBA team in a league where you don't, it's not transfers, it's trades themselves, but a team that gets stuck between two philosophies, right? And that's the reason I bring it up, is because it's not super popular for they're not a Fenway team, but look at the Boston Celtics several years ago, who made some big-time trades to bring in Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen to round things out with Paul Pierce to then win a championship, right? So they do that. And then not long after that, they realize those guys are getting a little bit older, and they blow the entire team up. Yeah. And that's not a popular move, but you can't get stuck in between two philosophies. You can't get stuck with that. And so I'm not saying that like we have to sell Mo and Virgil and everyone, and all the veterans and all. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that it seems like the team is not making like wholesale philosophical changes where they should. And it's worked. Like, for example, the Boston Celtics did blow the team up. Worked out well for them. They've been title contenders and favorites for the past several seasons. They had a couple of bleak seasons, but then they had every draft pick in the world. It's turned into some of the best players in the world. And what do you know? It's been working out okay for them. But it wasn't popular at the time. And so it seems like the club has to be willing to make, again, this comes down to like strong leadership, which right now we don't really have much front office leadership at all because everyone's leaving. But there has to be something about that where we have to be willing to make these philosophical changes to the way things are done or the way we handle transfers. We can't sit around trying to do like the generic pharmacy brand version of Michael Edwards' business. We can't keep doing that. We have to be willing to make some bigger adjustments to the way things are run. And most likely that won't happen until ownership changes. So it's weird. It's a weird place to be in, but it feels like a very in-between place to be in, at least right now.
Yeah, and I think that kind of comes to the final point is what is happening now and might have longer term implications. And it's totally understandable, but the strong leadership, like you mentioned, kind of puts sentiment to the side. And it seems like we are holding on to those players that we trusted and did get us here, but are not what they once were, or are good squad players, or are good to have around. And sometimes it's hard to let them go or just not play them as much. But I think that's kind of what we're going to have to do. We've really squeezed out every last drop of performance from a lot of these players, and I think we've just burned them out, unfortunately. But that's kind of the career of a footballer. Yeah. So we might have to start letting them go or sending them on loan, or just realize, hey, this is, if we're going to be a top team, like, you can't play as big a part as you used to. So I think those tough decisions are going to have to come up probably in the summer. I don't think they'll happen now because we just don't have the ability and time to invest in what we need. But there will have to be some departures for sure that will suck. Like, it will hate to see a lot of those people go, but they need to happen because then other people can come in and fill out the squad and grow into the role. And maybe it will be kind of rough like it is now as those players adjust, but I think it'll pay off down the line.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly it. You have to be willing to make those difficult moves at the beginning to set yourself up for later on. But you have to have the plan in place as well. You can't willy-nilly just get rid of everybody and then hope and pray that like it works out. And then you can't, think about Tottenham right after the Gareth Bale sale, right? Like, that sale happened. They had all this money. And instead of having a plan in place, they went out and bought a whole bunch of players that it did not work. And the team was a mess for a while until next thing you know, like it took them a while to get back to where they are right now, of being a team that actually, has something about them, but it took them several seasons because they didn't have that firm plan. And so it plays in. A major factor is not just making a move willy-nilly. So, all right, let me ask you this question, because you were talking a little bit about just kind of piggybacking off what you were just talking about, but a lot of, especially fans of rival clubs, like to try to make comments about the Mane effect and how all of the issues are because we got rid of the wrong guy, and that ball hog Mohamed Salah should have been the guy who gets sold, and Sadio Mane should have stuck around. All that. How much? Ultimately, obviously, we miss Sadio because he's an awesome player, right? But do you give any credence at all to any sort of like understanding that his desire to move away is playing into these larger factors? Obviously, us getting injured a lot and him not being available, that's a short-term immediate thing. But any
Yeah.
of like the long-term like chemistry issues, like the bigger picture stuff, do you give any, or do you buy into that narrative at all? Because I pretty much only hear it, and it could just be because the only people I know that watch the sport are, you know, United fans, just because of where I live, and it's absolutely miserable existence. But do you put any stock in that narrative at all?
It's not like we suck now because Sadio left. It certainly has affected how we play, and I think
Yeah.
him leaving changed how Klopp and staff think about our build-up play and our options coming out of the back, and even potentially who we wanted to bring in to replace him. And that part sucks, and that is good though, because the whole point of what we needed to do was change our style of play so we didn't become predictable and just do the same things over and over again. People scout us for a year and are able to block us.
Yeah.
I think we kind of had the plan in place to replace him with Diaz, and it was working, and then he got hurt.
Yes.
And then we have had to play not ideal fits out there, or Fabio Carvalho, who's adjusting to a new system and is a child. So it didn't really sit in. It's not really able to hit the ground running. And we've got Gakpo in now who can play that role as well, and should hopefully help. But to go along with that, like now we have our center forwards hurt, so we have to play Gakpo centrally and stick Ox out there. And it's just, we're stuck always filling gaps again, like we were in injury season part 1. And you can look at Chelsea for a good example as well. Like they have really good players, and you look at the lineups that they put out and you're like, oh, that team should be good. But it's not just about the names, and it's about how each player absorbs and interprets the role that they're given within the system. And right now we're fitting square pegs into round holes with a lot of how these players are interpreting the role of what we need them to do to be successful. I mean, Chelsea's having the same problem as well. So I think that's kind of the biggest miss for Sadio right now, is that we knew what we'd get out of him, and the team knew what we'd get out of him. And now no one is having a consistent partner in their area when they're trying to form triangles or go on overlaps and stuff. So they're just getting used to each other constantly. And that's why it looks so disjointed and just doesn't look cohesive at all. And this past match against Brighton, it just looked like everybody gave up and got frustrated with it.
It's crazy that literally last episode we were talking about how it seemed like targeting Gakpo specifically was that he was a good left winger that likes to play, that can drift in, while Darwin likes to start central and move out to the left. And as soon as we said that, all of a sudden it's like, well, now there's injuries. Now all that, who cares? It's like we had the plan.
He moved out too far to the left, to the bench, to the medical room.
Yeah. We were like, no, come back. But his English still isn't great. He's still working on that, so he didn't hear us anyway. Yeah, it's crazy that like in that moment we had the plan. We had, and it was pretty clear that we were working on a specific strategy or plan, and we still had the stupid injury bug happen. It's just insane how it keeps happening. But oh well, you have to deal with it anyway. All right, real fast. Obviously the upcoming schedule is the FA Cup again. So you've got that. Yeah, you've got that, and then you've got the derby coming up. No, why is that showing up? Yeah, right? Hold on. What am I looking at? I'm sorry. The schedule jumped up too far ahead of me. I was like, wait a second. That's February 13th. Sorry. You have the FA, then you have Chelsea coming up. So immediate looking on the horizon. Any relief from what you could look at? Any bright horizon coming around, or are we having to just trudge through the rest of January and hope that February gets a little bit better?
I think the latter. The Cup, I don't really know what to do with that right now.
Right.
It could be worth it to play more of our strong side like we did in the first tie of this, but that backfired because we played like garbage. But they also need to play together more to get some chemistry, so that could be an option. But then we've got another match this week, luckily against a team who's essentially in the exact same position that we are. that's just able to throw money at the problem and bring in 4,000 left wingers. So as long as we get extra support on the right side for that match, we'll be fine. Like someone drop and help Trent out because Trent plays attacking mid and Matip plays attacking mid, and they're both on the right side of our defense. So we need someone back there to cover. But that's really it. Like, I don't know what to expect out of these. I just know I'll probably be disappointed for a lot of both games.
I'm trying to look at like there's no trend to base any of this off of.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the annoying things here is it used to be, you could say, oh, you know what, we're doing pretty well against, better opponents, and then we suck against bad opponents. But right now we're just sucking against every opponent, and or at least seem to suck against the ones that are good, because as it turns out, Brentford and Brighton are doing awesome.
Yeah.
So the fact that we're sitting right next to Chelsea on the table makes me feel like this is not going to go well for us. And if Chelsea was just a couple places back, we'd be doing all right. But well. We'll see what happens. And whenever we get through these next couple of matches, we'll bounce back up here and record another episode and get back with you, listener, on these topics, hopefully with a little bit cheerier episode than this one. This, of course, had to just sadly enough be what it is, because the season is what it is right now. And so we are just trudging through best we can and trying to keep our spirits up.
Which is difficult.
It's so hard. But that will wrap up this episode of You'll Never Talk Alone. I want to thank you for tuning in. If you did enjoy this episode, please share it with some peoples. Leave a review. We are available on essentially any podcast provider that you might use, and would love for you to drop a review on there if you haven't, and pass on, share the episodes as well. Help spread the word on our return to podcasting here in 2023. That's Alex Lebel. I'm your friend Joseph Craven. It's been, I won't say a pleasure to present this episode to you, because this has been pain.
Ouch.
But we are happy to sit down and try to help process this entire season with you and alongside you, because as always, you'll never walk alone. That's the motto, that's the mantra, and that's how we as fans have to stick together during this difficult season so far. So for Alex, I'm Joseph. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time on You'll Never Talk Alone.
Ow, my hamstring.
Recorded. Oh no, Alex is hurt! Join us next week as we have to start a 16-year-old midfielder in place of Alex.
Our Academy podcasters got to step up.
Our Academy.